What I really want to talk about today is just more of what we started with. As far as setting up the parts for costing, I'm still really focusing on costing because I think it's kind of the first step before we think about pricing. So if I'm in control, last time when we were speaking, we were basically putting in a simple wide format estimate and looking at a couple of its parts. We just kind of went through it pretty quickly. What I want to do is kind of look at this and break it down more individual components and how different things affect it and what you're looking for. Basically, we're going through step 5. This was the estimate we were working on in the last meeting, where I'm just printing 10 18 by 24 inch vinyl signs and we're mounting it to Coroplast. I just want to add a number of components to it and then go through the different components. We just want to add them. So if I'm using a laminate, now again, this would be a back laminate or a list of adhesives that you had. I needed a secondary adhesive. Then your equipment too is really how you think about that is how you are managing it, meaning if I'm laminating this to the Coroplast all at the same time, meaning I'm sending the Coroplast through the laminator as well, I don't need a second equipment. It will look at whether I'm laminating or mounting through this first one. If I'm going to laminate it and then hand mount it differently or send it through a different laminator, that would also be different. Therefore, separating the two processes between cold laminating and other laminating. And then we want to talk about how we're cutting it out. So depending on what you're using, I'm just going to throw in an I-cut for now. This is any I-based cutter. And then the cut complexity. This cut complexity defines both how the calculation is working for perimeter. So simple, standard, and complex is really whether it's a square or not. Now square cut means it is just cutting between the two items, meaning all the way across the board for the most part, and never turning. So if they're just square cut, you have a lot fewer cutting than actually cutting something out in a circle or in a different method. Now, next I want to add some trim cap to this, and it's going to go around all the way around the sides. Then maybe they need magnetic strips or some type of Velcro, and I'm just going to put that down the top and the bottom, some Velcro. Now I could just do corners only. Any additional hardware in case I need to throw in a grommet or any additional hardware into this as well. Of course, easel backs you can throw in if you need. Any miscellaneous finishing, we can add these as well. We're going to round the corners on these things as well. Now based off of that, you will see a number of different components. This is all that's coming into this to create an estimate. All of them have their own cost, their own multiplier, and coming up with a retail price. What I want to talk about is how these prices are coming about and what we want to do to affect them and how they're affecting the overall performance of things. So I'm just going to open up a few of these parts to begin with. One is my cutter I wanted to talk about. The other one is my laminator. And we'll start there. Now, labor is always, other than when you get into electrical products and some of the more advanced products, is generally based off of an equipment. So rarely will there ever be any values to adjust in the labor other than what your labor rates are. That isn't necessarily true on the electric side when you get into some of the advanced labors. In this case scenario though, what this is doing is it's saying there's a one-time setup charge, one-time setup time, meaning it takes 10 minutes to load that particular laminator. And then it takes 180 linear feet an hour. If I'm mounting it, is it a different speed? So this would be the speed I'm putting the laminate through, but if I'm also putting the material and the laminate at the same time, this would be the speed. And then how much labor is required on that laminate. The thing that makes the biggest difference for most people when they're setting up their pricing is this setup time. Because this 10 minutes, if they only order one, I have a 10-minute there. On my cutter, I am adding another 10 minutes, which is all true to reality. But in the same sense, I'm now on that first, if they order one, I'm already just for the cutting and laminating at 20 minutes. So if my shop conversion rate is $40 an hour and I'm doubling that, you're looking at $30 just in those two components on that first line item, which isn't necessarily incorrect. What you need to think about, though, is your shop in general. Meaning, some shops you're generally set up in two categories. Either you can set things up real quick, or you can run them very fast. It's kind of the difference between a small shop and a huge shop. Your cost to get a job to the floor and up front and get everything set up, generally with a much larger shop, just between paper flow and people and organization, is a lot more than a small shop. But that giant shop is going to have a much faster equipment typically and be able to run through multiple productions at once. So thinking about how this divides in reality is that, okay, that big shop, it is going to cost him a lot to get that one-up order in, way more than it would the small shop. In the other sense, though, that large shop could run thousands way faster than that small shop in general, depending on equipment structure. So this setup time is going to build that curve between what one cost and 50 costs. So you want it to be in a reality, but you also don't want to overstate every little component that it takes to set up. If your cutter is set up 90% of the time with a blade to just run these things through, therefore there isn't a lot of setup time, note that, or it's going to build in a bigger curve between larger and smaller orders. Now, your per sheet, again, is the same thing. Right now, it's thinking it takes 5 minutes to load this cutter, and on some, on the Gerber CNCs, that type of thing, it may take 5 minutes to load each sheet and get it lined up, if not more. An iCut, maybe not. That's the whole idea of the iCut, is you should be able to throw it on there and hit hunt for it as long as the files or whatever are in line. So think of that as well. Now, the bit change time really only occurs, we only really utilize that when it comes to three-dimensional, so we don't need to worry about that so much. But as you can see here, on that first item they order, even if it's 12-inch by 12-inch, that's 15 minutes just to set up the cutter. So be careful in those setup charges. Now, other parts, like the laminator, same thing. The next kind of component I want to speak of are finishing components, because they have the same values. Now, all your finishing components, such as your grommets or anything else you may be using, here's a trim cap or Velcro. Let's take a look at those. They're all generally going to have the same type of function down at the bottom. There's a one-time setup, just like the others. There's a per-piece setup and a per-finishing item setup. Now, this will depend on the item itself. Right now, what it's saying, it's calculating labor, is that it takes 2 minutes per piece. And so that is the quantity on my order. So I'm ordering 10 of them. It's adding in 20 minutes immediately for that. And then it is adding in, says it thinks I can do 180 perimeter feet an hour to add this trim cap. But again, this 20 minutes may or may not be correct. And that may sound really simple, that 2 minutes, and it is when you're talking about quantity of 2 or 3. But if you're a company that deals in quantities of 500 and 1,000, well, that immediately is adding 500 to 1,000 minutes into this process, and it may or may not, if you're in that much of a production mode, require such a thing. If you do something in that regularly, which again, in dealing with cost, is going to affect the cost, can affect the cost significantly on large quantities. Okay, the Velcro and the rounded corners, again, working the same way. I look at my finishing, they're all going to have the finishing tab. Velcro thinks it's going to only take one time to set it up, and then I can do 320 perimeter feet an hour. But looking back at my cost on this estimate, I'm doing 10 of them, and now I've added a lot of finishing labor, which is 0.75. Generally, that is adding up the different finishing labors that are needed outside of your rounded corners, which are automatically applied. Like that's its own labor, is this alternate. Now we will look at that because it is its own labor. And again, it's still calculating on itself the one time per piece quantity per hour. And this is more of a quantity function rather than a perimeter function. Alright, so adding up these labors though, we have a ton of setup charges just based off of that complete function. And it's something to consider. Right now, if I'm doing one of these, I'm at 200, and that's again not real because I'm not worried about price at this point. But in cost factors, I have a cost of $90. And that is to do one Coroplast sign. Now I'm printing it, I'm laminating it, I'm cutting it out, onto Coro. I'm adding a lot of things to it, which are all adding into that particular cost. However, doing simple things in the setup, once you're comfortable this is correct, that's really what you're looking at is these estimated usages. So you want to really be careful when you're looking at something at what the usage is between 1 and 10, if not 1 and 100, because as you build up, of course, those setup times are despairing. And so right now I have a cost of $21 compared to when I was doing 1, I had a cost of $90. And that is an actual based off of how long each piece of the little processes you have to go through to get this consumed. So looking at these different components, again, we said the labors are really just a fraction of, and that's another thing that can have big effects. There are ways to getting around this as far as when you're pricing things even through a cost-based pricing. So if I did not want to charge for rounded corners, but I did want to track the cost of rounded corners, that you can do. We'll talk about that more when we get into pricing based off a cost-based structure, but don't...
Can I ask a question on labor?
What's that?
Can I ask a question on the labor?
Sure.
Now, do you enter the labor in at, let's say, at cost or at your overhead, or do you enter it at, let's say, retail?
This is a cost, and then it's being marked up. If we look at our labor, and I'll show you real quick as well. Right now we have a fixed cost of $45 an hour for finishing labor, and we're marking that up to $90 an hour because we're multiplying it by 2. I mean, this again is not necessarily your situation, just what it's doing currently. Now, if my cost was this high, for example, I may lower this multiplier and not mark it up so much. And that would have dramatic effects as well on this overall pricing. Because even that little simple, I've got so much finishing in this product. Let's jump back here. Well, I'm doing 100 now, but on 100 of them, let's just clone that. About a $300 difference, $200-something difference in just affecting that particular multiplier. Now, on a small order, it'll even affect it more than it did in a large order because there's just not a whole lot in there. So finishing labor is now only 0.17, but it is marking it up a lot less. Now, as far as where these costs come from, these $45 an hour, and where we came about these costs for labor, I do recommend in the setup steps, if I scroll down, you'll see 2 different spreadsheets. One is to figure out equipment cost, and one will help you with the overhead burden rate. Now I'm going to pop this up just so that we can talk about labor for a minute. Basically what you're doing what we've done, this is just a little help spreadsheet, is you're taking all your expenses for a year or for 6 months, whatever the period is. You're then removing all your direct material expenses, so anything that was a cost of good. You're removing all your labor, direct labor expenses. Now that means your production labor. I would not remove the labor for the people at the front counter who aren't producing the things you sell. So at management, administration, because we're tracking the labors, but we're not tracking those types of labors. We're really just pulling out equipment expenses. We already have the equipment as an expense, so we can remove that from our formula. And that gives you basically all your indirect expenses. And then we look at how many employees, and this is direct expense employees, so only the employees that actually do production, because your billing, your whole overhead is based on production. And they're really the profit center when you look at it. And then how many hours a day does the department run, or that labor is run, work days per month, and that breaks you down, labor hours, and you're basically calculating those out. So in this case, and then adds them together to give you a total price. So we have an overhead allocation, the direct labor, and then a burden rate. And this is what we're using in the system currently, as far as the numbers where we think about them. Again, these are going to be different for everybody because everybody's overhead is different and everybody's wages are slightly different.
So there's no factor for administrative wages?
That is left into the burden rate of overhead. So I took total expensive, which was administration, and only removed labor, production labor expenses. So it is still in the indirect expense category. So it's basically, this is the overhead burden rate, including management and people not in production. And so I recommend kind of going through that.
Did you have some questions about that, or how do you guys calculate it? There are certainly different approaches out there.
Well, we determined an overhead rate and came up with that. We'll call it, I guess we'll call it our burden rate, and then we've just over the years used took it and then marked it up, marked everything up the same. It's from shop wages to materials.
Oh, you're using the same multiplier across the board.
Basically, yes.
Okay. And you can do that, and we'll talk about that a little bit in control. This is just giving you your labor. And again, this is only cost, not how we're marking it up at all. Now, you could set up, everything at the same multiplier, and it would literally just always give you 40%. The reason I don't necessarily recommend that is because of your curve, meaning when you mark up labor and when you mark up equipment, because they have those setup times in it, it is affecting smaller orders a lot more than it is larger orders, because a percentage of that is all that upfront cost. When you change the margin on material, that is less a factor. So it's going to affect a price consistently whether they order 10 or 300 in this situation. That is going to maintain the same price all the way through. So by adjusting these multipliers, we'll get more into this in pricing, I'm kind of stepping ahead. Adjusting these multipliers differently, you can adjust that curve. By changing the labor to a 2 and this one to 4, this is affecting smaller orders less, so therefore I'm more in line with my market because I'm charging how the curve runs is it's actually less, it's going to be, of course, more per square foot, but that is going to define the curve. So controlling just these two numbers, if I'm just doing laminating and printing, just controlling my material cost and my print labor and my equipment multipliers, I can adjust the curve all over the place to where when I'm doing 100 I'm at the price point I need, and when I'm doing 10. If not, if they're all the same, that curve can be skewed and you can be very expensive up front and maybe even a little less than you need to be in greater orders. And that's why we get into suggested multipliers. And that'll actually be our class on Monday when I get way into more how to use multipliers. Right now we're just trying to really think about getting our costs correct so that when we go into multipliers, it'll all make sense. With me?
I think we might have moved that class to Friday.
Oh, that's correct, Friday.
I know things have been moving around a lot, but
yes, that's a Friday.
So if you can join us on Friday, we'll hit on that.
And we'll go through that as well. For now, what I really want you to think about are those setup times, because that's the kind of the driving factor that most people aren't considering when they're looking at what are my real costs.
Well, I saw that this morning. I just did a little quick test on, let's say, some vinyl cut letters, and we do a lot of snowmobile numbers here. So I typed in, the 2-inch letters. I typed in the 6 letters, and it gave me like almost a half an hour to send it out and weed it. And I thought, holy cow, that's an awful long time to do just 6 vinyl letters 2 inches tall. You know what I mean?
Right. But that's all in the setup, because it will take longer to do 6 per piece than it would 600 or 60 because of those. Getting it loaded in the machine, loading in your cutter, with the right control.
It adjusts on the fly when you jump up to 60?
When you jump up to 60, you still had the same setup charge, but that's already been accounted for. You're now only looking at run times, so your time per piece is going to go down.
Right.
Not the overall time, but your time per piece
right.
goes down based off of that setup time and your runtime curve. And so in vinyl, you have to, and in vinyl and in some other aspects, you do need to be fairly careful. Some of because some of them have a per piece on them. Looking at equipment, sorry. Like the cutters and things of that nature may end up giving you a price per piece, and if you're doing 5,000 2-inch by 2-inch, you really don't want to go by a per piece. You want to do more of a one-time setup. That'll often depend on your products and what you mainly do. Like this per piece charge, be very careful of that one if you do a lot of small items, no matter what you're looking at, because that adds $2 for every item they're doing. So for rounded corners, if I was doing a bunch of 4-inch by 4-inch items, now again, that's area-based pricing. It's actually charging 2 minutes. That could get very high. But again, if you're not doing thousands of decals and you're predominantly doing larger items, it may make sense. But generally, you'd want to use a one-time and a quantity per hour or finishing item per piece type time. All right. Now what I want to talk about, everything I've been doing, I've been jumping through all these different parts. I hope I'm not confusing you. I'm pulling them all directly from here. However, once I've got one part done, meaning I've gone in and I've done my Velcro, made sure that my times and stuff for that Velcro were working right, you're still going to go to the pricing adjust part information screen, go into your digital printing, that's where we are now, under wide format prints, or working out, and there are the finishing options. Now we're still dealing with just cost-based. Finishing materials. When dealing with finishing, you just really want to clone something that's in the right category, meaning I'm going to clone grommets, I'm going to include something for installation method, and an installation method could be magnets, install, etc. And then you have your grid of all the values that could be used in costing. This is the same values, again, that are on this screen when we were looking at it. The only difference is that they're laid out in a spreadsheet form. So once I'm comfortable with getting one of these items done, the rest are all going to flow through, meaning if I'm happy with the times for 1-inch Velcro, I'm probably going to be happy with the same time with 1.5-inch Velcro. So I'm just going to clone it and make sure all my numbers are in line with like and similar parts. And that's where it really becomes easier to work in the adjust part information screen rather than the individual parts, because I can go through and update everything at once. I do work in the parts individually, though, predominantly because I'm working in this estimate. I want to update something, immediately clone it, generally clone the line item to force the refresh to immediately see my results. And I'm trying to pinpoint down all these different components in this one sign. Once I fairly comfortable with my components, of course I'm then going to go in and change my quantity and do the exact same thing. Okay, well, if I'm doing this many, are these times looking comfortable? Because if not, you need to adjust the times, whether it's a print speed, whether it's something else. And printing that work order and sending it out to production with the part materials, like we did at the end of last meeting, is highly valuable here. Because if you have a job in the shop of 1,000 of something, or 500, or 100 even, or even 10 and 1, if you duplicate those, you can start pulling back real numbers. And then it allows you to tweak it. So once I've got one or two items really narrowed down, then I have my base to work from. I generally then know my cost I'm comfortable with and my usage I'm comfortable with. So then I'm jumping into the adjust part information screen and updating everything else and updating all the rest of my components that are in like and similar categories because it's already been thought out. Now once you've done that, I may go run some tests on some other things that could be slightly different, but they should all be about in line with like material. Alright, now once we've set up a part like this, I really want you to focus in wide format prints or flatbed prints if you're not doing roll to roll to get your head around the entire process. Once we get that really cleaned up, it'll make everything else go much smoother because you'll have your base that's already set the way you think it should be. However, when you set up products, like I set up this flat stock material product, this is the same flat stock material category that's in the other products. You will not need to set it up twice. So if I set up my Lexan, if I go into, cut vinyl signs, that Lexan, this will already be there for flat stock under cut vinyl signs. So you're not really duplicating your work. Now you may have to add a couple because in flat stock, for vinyl you may not have added them all. And on the right in this list tells you where they're going to be used. So once I've added polycarbonate, I can tell it. Am I directly printing on it? Am I mounting to it? Am I applying cut vinyl to it? Am I screen printing, engraving, and doing dimensional? Now all dimensional is the same thing as cutting on wide format print. This here and this here, the material and the cut method, that is all dimensional is. So as soon as you finished a wide format, this is already set up. You've already set up the cutters, you've already set up the materials. Now you may add more because you may be doing dimensional out of woods and things that you're not printing directly on, but they're still there and the processes for your cut method are still there. So we're focusing on wide format, but at the same time you are setting up a large portion of the rest of the system. The same is true with like vehicle wraps. If you set up wide format with all the equipment and all the materials, you're almost done with vehicle wraps. The only thing you're going to have left is what kind of vehicles you want to print, because your printer and your materials and all that are already set up. So that's kind of why I'm trying to keep everything focused into one product, get it really narrowed down to where, yes, I'm happy with that, and then spread out, to be able to make all your other costs work. Now, again, we get into pricing. We'll talk more on that as far as adjusting the pricing or adjusting the pricing per type of thing you're doing. But that's really normally it on additional things in costing. I said on Friday we'll talk about multipliers and how to think about those in relation to these costs and in the curve. We'll also discuss area-based pricing, which we haven't touched base on now so far, which is basically saying it's so much a square foot based off the material with other factors, rather than trying to come up with a cost and basing it off of that. You can do both. I think most companies want to have a general idea of their cost, regardless of how they want to price it. That's one of the reasons we go through this first. But don't get hung up if you're not finding costing working for you. We'll go into area-based pricing as well. And I'll also go into how they relate. I could get the price almost exactly the same either way with enough backing out of everything.
On the pricing, like when it does an estimate on the pricing, is there a way to, rather than having an item sitting at, let's say, $36.22, is there a way just to set up rounding?
Yes, there is. There's two different methods of rounding. Like right now, you can either round on the unit price or the overall price. Where that is to set it up, it's a little hidden. It's a good question. I rarely get it. If I'm wide format print product, if I go to view product, okay, this is the actual product itself, not the part. On the pricing tab, you'll see an advanced button. Based off of this advanced button, you can round. Right now it's rounding to the penny. I could round this to the dime, to the dollar, etc.
Right. Yeah, as well, is there a tab or a little back door to adjusting the text size on the work orders and the estimates?
Fortunately, not really. That's a Crystal Report issue, kind of how it mixes with other things. Now, you can modify those. Text size isn't real easy to do because it doesn't always flow to the report, but you can bold and do some other things. That's more in an advanced class, but that is basically what prints on an estimate and invoice is adjustable. It's all done in formula based, so is the work order. So these can be modified. I recommend you kind of figure out exactly what you want it to do,
right,
and where, and then kind of send it to your point person and have them look over it with you, and then they can better explain how to get
you
there.
write into the code.
Yeah, you're kind of writing in a formula language, so it's best. Unless you want a learning curve, I would just send it to somebody and ask them to take a look at it for you.
Sounds good. Another question on specific products. So let's go back to the snowmobile number example. Like we have standardized pricing per color. So is there a way to set up a product where it just automatically, a one color price for sled numbers is this, a two color price for sled numbers is that?
Sure. Now you're pricing per color, per square foot type of thing?
Well, we've just set up standardized pricing, and so I don't really want the system to make an estimate as much as when somebody keys in an order for, let's say, a snowmobile number, it just automatically pops up our standardized number that we set for the year.
Okay. So what we're talking about is more or less creating a product of its own just for those numbers, right?
Right.
Sure. And so basically, and we'll get into this in pricing more instead of costing. I would still set it up as the your costing all combined in your cut vinyl RTA. Sounds like that's what you're doing, right? It's
Yeah.
an RTA.
Yeah.
So I would still set this up, and then what we'll do, and we'll talk about this some in pricing, is we'll clone this to create other products and then set all the defaults to what you want. As well as you can then control the pricing different if you wanted to control prices per color. We'll kind of talk about that. And that's more kind of using an area-based pricing and customizing your products for you. Still use all the same materials, still use all the same plotters, but what we'll do is we'll clone it and then set those defaults so that when you choose that snowmobile lettering or whatever, the plotter will already be defaulted, the vinyl type will already be defaulted, so all you're doing is choosing the colors and the size.
Right. Now on vinyl plotters, or let's say cutting plotters, like a Gerber plotter or Suma plotter, when I was looking in there, it had these numbers, like 360 inches an hour, or whatever the number was. Like, how do we determine that number? And realistically, I've got a Suma plotter that'll cut 50 inches a second, but we would never make that machine. That's not a reality. Yeah.
Yeah, that's not a reality. That's why I'm a big believer in just running some of these test orders, like I've been talking about, even before you even try to tweak those numbers. If you want a starting point, I may run, especially if you have an order in the job, a job in the shop. Just take a job you have in the shop that's fairly normal, put it in the system, print it out the work order with the bill of materials, send it through the shop, because in that bill of materials it's going to have what it was estimated at and a spot for them to put actual. Once you start seeing numbers, okay, so this 118 by 24s took this long, I can back out of that. We can back out from there and say, okay, that's so many square feet an hour, but it did take how long to set it up. Pull that out, and you can kind of back out from reality.
Okay.
Because yeah, what the equipment manufacturers tell you will never work. It will never hit reality. And everyone's different. You know, every shop is different as far as how fast they can get different components complete.
Right.